Okay, Ayşegül Avcı is currently working at Sabancı University in Istanbul as a coordinator and instructor of humanity and society. She graduated from Hacettepe University, Department of American Culture and Literature, and she continued her education at Bilkent University. Ayşegül Avcı earned her PhD from History Department, Bilkent History Department in 2016 with her dissertation entitled Yankee Levantine, David Offley, and Ottoman American Relations in the Early 19th Century. She was awarded TÜBİTAK Research Fellowship to pursue her PhD research in Washington, D.C. between 2013 and 14. She also visited Boston University as a Fulbright postdoctoral fellow during the academic year 2021 and 22. Among her research interests are American history, culture and literature, digital humanities, Ottoman, Turkish and American relations, ranging from social and cultural to diplomatic and commercial interactions. Her current research focuses on digital humanities tools to integrate literary sources with historical archives. Okay, the floor is yours, Ayşegül.
Thank you very much. Let me first thank you all for inviting me here and for giving me the opportunity of sharing my work with you. This is an ongoing project, so I would appreciate if you have any observations or suggestions at the end of the speech. Let me share my screen. Okay. Today, I would like to talk about the transformation of the Turkish image in American narratives in the first half of the 19th century. And I will start by giving a depiction of what this Turk meant in European and American narratives and how it was inherited from Europe. And later I will continue with the duplication in Barbary captivity narratives and its reinforcement during the Greek War of Independence. All these 3 points actually focus on the terrible Turk image. But the last point, the reproduction of this Turk by the American travel narratives gives you a different approach to Turks, maybe a little bit more positive approach to Turks. That's why I use my title as Prejudice versus Experience. Turk, the word Turk actually used as a blanket term to cover all Muslims. So it referred to Ottoman Muslims, North African people, Persians, and Arabs. So instead of referring to an ethnic origin, it actually covered all the Muslims. And it covered a very large geographical region. The terrible Turk image was created in Europe in the 11th century when Byzantine Empire first encountered the Turkish principalities, and later it was transferred into the US during the colonial period. American church was one of the most important meeting places during the colonial period, and that was where the ideas were shared with people, and it was the ideas were shared among the people. And this is how this terrible Turk image also spread via the colonial church. Turk, this terrible Turk, meant here in these narratives an infidel Muslim. However, the Americans were represented as pious Christian. Here, maybe I should say that although the colonial Americans did not actually face this Muslim threat or terrible Turk, they used the image, Turkish image, as a counterstance to create an American identity. In this respect, while Turk is the cruel despot, American would be the kind and good democratic citizens. Depending on the European experiences in the Barbary, Turks were represented as pirates, while the Americans were civilized people. And in terms of physical descriptions, Turks were generally depicted as having darker skin color, but the Americans were represented as white people. And in terms of clothing, turban was a very important item. Turks were generally depicted as wearing that clothing, while the Americans were generally depicted as wearing modern clothes. Let me start with this excerpt from Cotton Mather. He was one of the most famous and influential clergymen in Boston. And in March 1703, he gave a talk to his congregation. And here he actually borrowed the words of King William and Queen Mary. In this speech, he addressed to his congregation and said, "A great number of our good subjects, peaceably following their employment at sea, have been taken by the Turkish pirates in North Africa, and they were kept as slaves in cruel and inhumane bondage, without any days of rest. They suffered under extreme labor, and some of them were barbarously murdered. In terms of their diet, they had limited access to food and water, and the food was constituted of decayed barley, and it stinks so bad that even the animals refused to eat it. And their taskmasters were generally blackamoors who whipped them constantly to the extent that some of them actually died." So here in this excerpt, we see several reference to the cruelty of Turks, the inhumanity, and the physical and psychological torture that the captives suffered under this captivity. The Barbary States, in Turkish we call Berberi devletleri, were actually the North African states here. At the time, they were part of the Ottoman Empire, and piracy constituted a great amount of their income. They attacked the vessels, they seized their cargoes and later sold them. They captivated people and used them in laborers, and sometimes they sold them back to their countries in return of a ransom, and sometimes they collected tribute from the European countries. However, during the colonial period, Americans did not actually face the Barbary threat because they were using the British flag. After the independence, they started using their own flag, and realizing that there is a new country without any agreement, these North African states started to attack American vessels. The first attack was around, it was in 1784, and it continued for several years, several decades actually. And the Americans began to be captivated. One of them is Jonathan Cowdery. He was a surgeon on the ship Philadelphia. His ship was attacked on October 31st in 1803, and he was kept as a slave for several years. He kept a diary, and after his return to his home, he published it. And these excerpts, these diaries or letters that were later published in the US, generated this Barbary captivity narratives. This excerpt from Cowdery actually repeats some of the motives that was explained in Cotton Mather's excerpt. The wind from the desert was very heavy and hot. The climate was one of the important items that really pushed these captives, American captives, because they were not very used to heavy and hot weather. The men almost perished in sand, and when they stopped through fatigue and asked the driver, who was a Turk, for liberty to drink at a well which was near them, the Turk refused them and called them Romokelps, Christian dogs, and he gave them no water, but instead he gave them a severe beating, and the poor fellows had to drag, loaded with timber, through the burning sand. So the physical torture composed of lack of food, lack of water, or this extreme labor, combined with this psychological torture, was very heavy for the American captives. James Leander was another captive who was taken by Algiers, and he was kept as a slave more than 10 years. And in his book, he explains in great detail of all the sufferings. And at some point, besides criticizing this slavery, he also offers a criticism towards his own country, his own government. He expected the American government to save them, but knowing that American treasury at that point was very weak, he expected American citizens and American businesses to help the treasury. But this redemption did not come for over 10 years, and he wrote, in captivity, he experienced every indignity that barbarians could invent to render the life of a Christian miserable in the extreme. So we see here how he how he creates a confrontation between the Muslims and the Christians and accuses the Muslims for inventing all kinds of indignity to force these Christians. The Barbary threat ended after the American-British War of 1812. America conducted a military attack on barbaric nations, Barbary States, or North African states, and by 1817, the Barbary threat ended for American sailors. However, the terrible Turk image did not end with the Barbary threat, because a few years later, the Greeks under the Ottoman Empire rebelled against the empire, and it created a climax of Philhellenism, both in Europe and in the United States. Lord Byron, this famous British poet, was actually one of the leading figures in creating and supporting the Greek independence. He visited the Greek peninsula around 1809 and 10, and after his return, he wrote the first two cantos of this Child's Herald. And here he writes, "Fair Greece, sad relic of departed worth, immortal, though no more, though fallen, great." He recognizes the greatness of ancient Greece, and he continues, "Who now shall let thy scattered children forth and long accustomed bondage uncreate?" So he is expressing his desire to see Greece as a free and liberated nation. He was not the first person who actually expresses this wish, but he became very famous. He joined the Greek War of Independence. He fought on the side of the Greeks against the Ottoman Empire, and he actually lost his life in one of these battles. Later, before his death, of course, he wrote this very famous piece, The Isles of Greece. "The mountains look on Marathon, and Marathon looks in the sea." The reason why Byron chose Marathon as his setting is because the ancient Greece fought very bravely against the Persians in this war. And he continues, "I dreamed that Greece might still be free. For standing on the Persian's grave, I could not deem myself a slave." By recognizing his roots that lead to the ancient Greece, he also considers himself as a Greek person. He understands that the Western countries, Western nations owe a lot to the ancient Greece. And by sharing his desire to see Greece as a liberated country, he also denies slavery. Lord Byron, again, as I said, became very famous, and his influence was felt in the United States. There were many poets who were inspired by Lord Byron's Romanticism, and they published several works in literary magazines and in the newspapers in the United States. One of them, Samuel Woodworth, wrote, "A year ago, and Greece was all the rage. That is, we felt enraged against the Turks." By sharing his frustration against the Turks, Woodworth was not the only one, and he combines the feelings, the emotions of almost all of the Americans felt against the Turks. He talks about the battles and massacres imposed by Turks on the Greek people, this self-devotedness of patriot men who showed heroic deeds, who did heroic deeds. Wives, mothers, maids compelled to slay themselves or yield to these infernal turbaned elves. As I said at the beginning of my speech, turban is one of the clothing that was highly used to represent Turks. And by using these infernal and elves around this word turban, he actually shares his views and he calls for support for the Greek cause. American support to Greek cause was not limited with the literary spheres. Of course, it was highly published in American newspapers too. And one way of doing that was borrowing from British newspapers. There were many letters written by Greeks that were published in British newspapers, and then Americans republished them in American newspapers. One such letter was written by this young Greek. This ferocious incendiaries, he says, these tigers, he is referring to Turks, 1,000 times more cruel than those of the forest, have vented that hatred upon the dead, which they bear to the living. They opened the tombs and they threw into the streets the bones of our fathers. Graveyard is very sacred in both religions, for both societies. But Turks, the idea is trying to be given here is that Turks are so barbarous and cruel that they even opened the tombs and threw the bones of our fathers. Another letter, again written by a Greek house, defines these Greeks as innocent young children who have fallen victims to the most horrible death caused by the brutal conduct of those monsters. We see a lot of victimization of Greek people and depiction of them as innocent children, while the Turks are generally depicted as cruel and brutal monsters. These were written upon the Chios massacre in 1822, and it was a very important event during the Greek War of Independence in gaining support from the American people. Another place where the Americans shared their ideas were the travel narratives. But there is one point that I would like to make here. The American travelers did not visit Greek peninsula during the Greek War of Independence. So instead they visited after the end of the war. So what they wrote in their narratives were actually heard from other people, either the Greeks or the Europeans. Clemuel Green Ricketts visited around 1840s, and he wrote upon what he had heard about the Chios massacre, then commenced an unparalleled work of destruction. The island was desolated from one end to the other by conflagration, plunder, and death. The females were sold for slaves, the men and male children massacred. I'm going to talk a little bit about this enslavement of the females, but still, I would like to repeat my point that these are heard from other people. John Lloyd Stephens, another very influential travel narrator, he became a bestseller, not only in the United States, but in Europe too. And again, he shared his ideas similar to Ricketts by writing that my feelings were so wrought upon that I felt my blood boil at the first Turk I met in the streets. I felt that I should like to sacrifice him to the shades of the murdered Greeks. There are many travel narratives that share these similar ideas and feelings towards Turks and towards Greeks. And the American readers who were sitting in their homes, in their home country, reading those words, actually felt the same way towards the Turks during and after the Greek War of Independence. throughout the war lasted around 10 years. And during the war, the events were commonly published in American newspapers. And while the Turkish victories were given with titles such as Horrors of Greece, or Turkish Barbarities, or Massacre of the Greeks, Turkish victories were given with titles such as Glorious News from Greece, or Greek Skill and Heroism. I just picked a few of the titles here for you, just made a collage, but there are hundreds of such accounts in American newspapers. The American government did not support Greek Revolution officially, but there were many American citizens and American charity organizations that sent aid to Greek rebels. There was also a group of Americans in Izmir who tried to help these Greek captives who were enslaved in Greek peninsula or in these islands and brought to Smyrna to be sold in these slave markets. David Offley was one of the first resident merchants in Smyrna, and he was the first American consul in that city. And he wrote about this Greek girl of about 12 years of age. This child was in the hands of a particularly ferocious and bad Turk. He had her tied up and beaten to force her to renounce her religion. Again, we keep hearing these similar motives like physical torture or psychological torture conducted by these Muslim Turks on Christian, innocent Greek children. Her beauty of the Greeks was again repeated in American narratives. Her tender age had exposed her to every insult from this barbarian Turk. And later he shares his desire to see his countrymen to help these captives to rescue Christians from the Mohammedans. At the end of the Greek War of Independence, the American Philhellenism started to wane down, and they started to look at the Greek people in the Ottoman Empire from a different perspective. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, but there is also one other reason why the Americans started to build a new perspective of the Turkish people. In the 19th century, Americans started to travel all around the world, and it included the Ottoman Empire, particularly Izmir and Istanbul. And before dealing with the travel narratives, I would like to continue with David Offley, who came to Smyrna in 1811. And after 7 years, he wrote a letter to one of his sisters, and he wrote about Islam. Their prayers might be cited as examples to Christians as most perfect on the goodness of God. He writes, a good Muslim will see himself bereft in one moment of wife, children, and fortune, and instead of accusing the God for his punishment, he is then consoled in the assurance of his love. So it is very exceptional to read these words from an American himself. He depicts Islam and this Muslim God as a good God. And he accepts that there might be some good Muslim people and that their prayers might be cited as examples to Christians. The assurance of love is very exceptional to read. George Barrell, another traveler, he also shared his ideas about Islam, and he wrote that he respected Islam. They worship the same God that we do. They esteem our Savior, Jesus Christ, as a great prophet and lawgiver. Their prayers are evidently offered with a sincere heart. Again, we hear about the goodness of Islam and the goodness of Muslims and sincerity of them in their prayers. Another traveler, again, I'm going back to this Ricketts, who shared his ideas about the massacre in Chios, condemning the Turks. He wrote again about Islam, but this time he also included the honesty of Turks must strike every observant traveler. With perfect safety, the traveler may sleep in his tent and leave all his belongings outside of his tent, and nothing will happen to his belongings, because according to his Greek guide, the Turkish religion forbids stealing. Truth is the twin sister of honesty, he continues, that the Mohammedan dares not lie, his religion forbids it. By using the term Turkish religion instead of Islam, he also recognizes or maintains the idea that the word Turk is used to cover all the Muslims, but here he also offers a link between the honesty of Turks and their religion. This honesty is repeated in almost all of the travel narratives, by the way, because it was very surprising for Americans. They were shocked and surprised to see that virtue in the Turkish people. I said that American opinion towards Greeks began to change after the Greek War of Independence. And one reason is related to missionary activities. The first missionaries came to Izmir in 1820, and their first target was Greeks. They wanted to convert Greeks into Protestantism, but seeing that they were really reluctant, they turned their attention to the Armenian population. And afterwards, they created or they depicted the Greeks in a more negative way. Daniel Temple was one of the missionaries who was stationed in Izmir in 1840s, and his house was burnt down during a fire in the city, and he ran away from his house to save himself. But from a distance, he turned back and saw a Turk holding a very large club in his hand and laying it about him upon the pilfering Jews and Greeks, with a dignity and firmness that filled me with admiration and then with fear. It is interesting to see how he depicts Jews and Greeks as pilfering, as thieves. On the other hand, depicting the Turks with a feeling of admiration. Moreover, he continues, this brave fellow. Bravery was attributed to Greeks during the War of Independence, but here attributed to Turk. This brave fellow has not returned to ask any reward, which tells him that the Turk did not do it in expectation of an award, but because of his idea of justice and his honesty. James Dickey, another traveler, he mentions his prejudices based upon what he had read and heard from other people. He thought that before coming to Turkey, Ottoman Empire, he thought that the Turks were opium eaters and gamblers. But, he continues, we have witnessed nothing of the kind. So the voracious traveler, the traveler whom he heard or read this prejudiced or preconceived opinions against Turks, has in all probability mistaken Greeks for Turks and imputed to the latter the notorious propensities of the Hellenic race. A few years ago, the Hellenic race was the virtuous race. It was glorified, it was embraced in American narratives. But here we see a direct opposite, a direct replacement between the Greeks and Turks. Walter Colton was an officer in the Mediterranean Squadron, and he had a chance to visit Izmir in 1830s, and he saw this Turkish store owner, and he wrote that this Turkish store owner would never cheat his young customers. This is more than can be said generally of the Franks. The word Frank is used to refer to foreigners living in Ottoman lands. So these are Europeans, Americans, in general, Christians. The Franks are all smiles and deception, politeness and imposition. So the Turk, though vastly less attractive and engaging, is the safer man to deal with. Again, we see an emphasis upon the honesty of Turks, but this time he is comparing the Turk to the Christians, and in all these comparisons here, we see Turk as a more virtuous man. The American narratives, travel narratives, are also essential because they recognize the prejudice in their books. James Dickey visited Istanbul, and he was accompanied by a group of Turkish soldiers. And in one of his conversations with this Turkish soldier, he said that in America, we had been led to believe that a Turk never smiled, and that they regarded the slightest jest with aversion. But later, we were agreeably surprised to find them a set of jolly dogs. In response, the Turkish soldier said, he also was surprised to find the Americans such polished and agreeable people, and not, as he had been informed, complete savages. So here we see both of these communities, both the Turks and the Americans, had preconceived ideas about each other, and these preconceived ideas are generally very negative. And this Turkish soldier continues by saying that he hopes to see reciprocal esteem and respect in the future. These travel narratives were published as books generally, but sometimes the travelers sent letters to their loved ones in the US, and sometimes these letters were published in American newspapers. One of them, written by an American gentleman who visited Smyrna, Izmir, wrote that the unfavorable impression which is generally prevailing in America against the Turk is very erroneous, for they are much more correct and honest than the Greeks, Jews, and any other nations in this part of the world. A great deal had been said about the barbarity and oppression, but I have found them an honest, obliging, and even generous people. I am not claiming here that the honest Turk, the image of the honest Turk replaced the terrible Turk image. It did not. We still continue to see this terrible Turk image in American narratives. And in the second half of the 19th century, we see another representation of Turk, which is slightly different, not necessarily very positive or negative. But both of these images, the honest Turk and the terrible Turk, coexisted in the American narratives, beginning with the first half of the 19th century, beginning with American experiences, American conception of the terrible Turk came from Europe, was later produced in Barbary captivity narratives and reinforced in the Greek war, during the Greek War of Independence. But there was European influence in all of these stages. In American travel narratives, they got to meet the Turks themselves. I would like to end my speech with this excerpt from George Barrell, who wrote, "The unhappy prejudices of the Christian world against the professors of Muhammad's creed, which had been instilled into my mind, led me to fear 1,000 dangers where none existed. On the African shores, shipwreck would be attended by death of slavery, but when the seaman approaches that part of Asia inhabited by Turks, he may with safety bury all alarm and rest satisfied that although he is not near a Christian country, still he will find among the inhabitants all the virtues possessed by Christians, with but few of their vices. He is actually summarizing everything that I am trying to explain to you in this work, in this presentation. He first of all makes a differentiation between the Turks of the Ottoman Empire and Turks of the North African states that are generally depicted as the Barbary. He also makes a differentiation, and he recognizes the prejudice that is very common in Americans and in American narratives. And finally, he admits that one should not label a religion or a community as pure evil or pure good, because both of these communities, both the Christians and the Muslims, have virtues and unfortunately have some unfortunate characteristics. And sometimes the Muslim or Turkish virtues might be better than Christians. Thank you very much for inviting me and for listening to me. And I would be happy to hear your observations. And if you have any questions, I will try to answer them as best as I can.
Thank you so much, Ayşegül. It was really interesting. I'm now having complicated feelings about being a Turk myself. So if you have any questions, we have like 20 minutes for question and answers. You can also use the chat section to write your questions and comments as well.
Hi, is my mic on?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hi, thank you, Aisha Ghoul. That was interesting. And I appreciate the amount of research that you must have had to do in order to put all that together. I think that was, and it must have been a fun and exciting project to research.
It was.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, but I think I'd like to start with the one that I can tell that you've done a lot of research and you've marshaled together a great deal of narratives regarding American views of Turks. There was one thing that I didn't hear, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about it, because you said this was kind of an ongoing project. And I think it's just most generally, now that you've marshaled all of this evidence together, what's your conclusion about these particular views of various narratives in regard to Turkey? Like, what do you think? What are they doing?
My views about specifically, I'm not sure I understand your question.
All right, I'll ask it again.
By the way, I cannot see you, and I don't know who is talking.
Jeff is talking.
Yeah. Hi, Jeff.
Hi.
Sorry.
Okay. You've marshaled together all of these great narrative examples, but I'm wondering what it is that you're concluding from all of these narratives. Is it that Americans saw Turks as barbarians? Because that's not a particularly interesting one. I think that you have a more interesting one. I'd like to know what it is.
Here's the thing. As I concluded, the barbar Turk or the terrible Turk image continued to exist in American narratives. But what I found interesting here is that this introduction of a new Turkish image, a more positive Turkish image, that is not the Barbary, on the contrary, that was honest and sincere, and it was related some part to their religion too. There are several representations of Turks, like the lustful Turk. I did not talk about that because I had to limit my search here. My conclusion is that depending on the experiences, individual experiences, Americans, on one point, they were able to drew themselves out of the European influence and started to view the world from their own points of view individually. And on the other hand, by creating this more positive Turk image, their relations, the diplomatic and commercial relations also changed in the second half of the 19th century. So there is a direct influence, I would say, on the American perspective on the relations with the Ottoman Empire. And the same way, the Ottoman Empire also had prejudices, and that we see a change throughout these interactions, how the Ottomans, or not necessarily people, but the Ottoman government also changed their views about the American government and American people, or in general, American technology, the technological advancements, or military power. So I don't know if I can answer your question, Jeff.
Yes, I think so. I think you did, to my satisfaction. I think what you said was that the individual experiences of Americans were beginning to create their own impressions of Turkey rather than simply relying on those that they were inheriting from Europe. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. Great. Okay, great. Thank you very much. I just wanted to add something that I found very wonderful and humorous, is the idea of looking at Americans as barbarous themselves, as wild. You see that in Dickens and his novel Martin Chuzzlewit, when he goes to America, and I think he's in Louisiana or somewhere, and it's literally, he might as well be in in Vietnam. I mean, it's just like really dense woodlands, and it's terrifying, and Americans are brusque and savage, and it's really the view that Americans had of Native Americans in Dickens was the view that the English had of Americans. So I thought that was really cool that you brought that up, and I like that because I didn't know that. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your contribution. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, Trevor.
Okay, thank you. I think this is going to repeat elements of what Jeff was just saying, because I also think that you accumulated quite a lot of empirical evidence, presented quite a lot of empirical information about American views of Turks, right? But I wonder whether, in fact, you could go a little bit further beyond that empirical account and ask, I think the way Jeff posed this was, what are these narratives doing, right? I think the way I would pose the question would be, what purpose or what function is being served by the narrative of the barbaric Turk? What psychological function, what ideological function, what discursive function is being served by that? And I think actually the same question could then also be asked of what ideological function, what psychological function, what discursive function is being served by the more positive view of the Turk. And I'm not at all satisfied by the idea that prejudice is somehow dispelled, right? The prejudice followed by Enlightenment model, for me, just doesn't cut it, and seems to come back to the limitations of an overwhelmingly empirical account of, okay, but Turks say barbarians, barbarians, barbarians, and then Turks, and then we turn to more positive representations of Turks. Why? How? What function are these serving?
The barbar Turk, or this terrible Turk image served for the Americans in terms of creating an identity, creating an American identity, starting from the colonial period, by using this Turkish image as a counterstand, as an opposition. They were able to define themselves as more civilized and democratic people. And it was especially important at the early American period in the 19th century, because it was a very new republic, and it was trying to situate its roots, and it tied its roots to the ancient Greek. It is seen in American literature, in American architecture, and the Barbar Turk used as a identity creation, let's say. Secondly, during the Barbary episode, that the American confrontation with the Barbary States, in the early period, the American government was reluctant in establishing a strong navy because of the financial problems per se. But seeing that there is a direct threat that the government should protect, especially the merchants and the merchandise, the government has to build a strong navy, and it was discussed in the Senate a lot. And Americans actually built that navy and sent it on the North African countries to subdue these countries, to end this threat. So it was also used as in a military point of view. It functioned in this military point of view. You are definitely right about this direct change about the from the Barbary Turk to the honest Turk. It did not happen immediately, of course. In these narratives, in these, especially the travel narratives, we see the coexistence of both of these representations. They start with the Greek Revolution, and they express all their anger and frustration, but then they continue after seeing that, well, Turks might not be the evil that as they were depicted, is used again to represent, to create an American discourse, let's say, aside from the European discourse. It coexisted, it continued. The terrible Turk did not end. I'm sure if we look at the American narratives today, I'm sure we can find still some impressions of this terrible Turk. So there is no way that I'm claiming that it ended. How it functioned? First of all, more and more Americans started to visit the Ottoman lands, and we see the increase in American missionary activities that are directed to the Armenian population. And after signing the agreement in 1830, they started building relationships between the US and the Ottoman Empire, not necessarily limited to diplomatic and commercial relations, but also expertise. There were many Americans who were invited by the Ottoman government to come to live on and to teach the Ottoman military or Ottoman agricultural students, let's say. So we see an increase in these relations. So I would say that is another function. But there is, let me be clear on that, the impression or the depiction did not completely change with the introduction of this honest Turk.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to add, now, I don't regret having asked my question in a somewhat aggressive manner, because I think what you just said was actually so much more interesting than your talk itself. I really mean that.
Okay, thank you very much. No, I didn't take it as an aggressive question. Don't worry about that.
Emine Hocam.
Yeah. Yes, Ayşegül Hocam, thank you very much for your very deeply analyzed and carefully planned speech. It was an honor for me to be your listener here. And first of all, I would like to ask you a question And then I would like to add something. I mean, talking about this terrifying or barbaric Turks or the barbaric Muslim people, I think it stems from the very, very old beginning in the history of Britain, when during the time of Crusades, the first one, Richard III, who was also known as lion-hearted, and he was defeated by Selahattin Eyyubi. I think because they occupied the Holy Land and they need to be kicked out, and therefore all negative attributions were ready just to label them as barbaric, as criminals, as whatever, uncivilized, the terror of the world. I think this comes from that dilemma and still going on. But that was good that you also mentioned some positive attitude towards Turks. And what do you think? And my second addition will be that when we were studying Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, and it was in the epilogue of the night, I guess, the first story, the first tale, and we found out that when he is describing the knight, he says he was very gentle, courageous knight who fought very bravely against Turks. Can you imagine? And Canterbury, that was in 14th century, and just 1934, maybe 1384. Let me correct myself. And he used this term Turk as a title, and there is no negative attitude added to this title as Turk. Yeah, which is good. I mean, my students, they were very proud to see that they said, look, teacher, how brave were Turks and fought the Christians with the soldiers of Richard III. Yeah, that's it. And Geoffrey Chaucer just recycles this positive attitude in his Canterbury Tales, his masterpiece. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emine Hocam. Yes, in the British literature, there were many depictions of Turks, both as terrible and maybe not so terrible, and they were actually. I can't remember exactly at which date, but in Europe we start to see a different depiction of Turks, especially with the Reformation, because in order to compare within Christianity, the Protestantism and Catholicism, sometimes we see the Pope or the Catholic people depicted as even more cruel than the Turks. So it might be, it is very possible to see this another version of this terrible Turk in the British literature. I read a piece from Canterbury Tales when I was a student at Hacettepe, but it has been many years ago, so I don't really remember the details of that. But yeah, that would be interesting for something to look at.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Evren.
Thank you, Ayşegül. As I was listening to your talk, by the way, my microphone is awful, so I'm not hearing well. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Good, I do.
As I was listening to your talk, I kept thinking of Orientalism by Edward Said, you know, because you talking about the stereotypes and the stereotypical image of the Turk. Later on, when Said's work was criticized, the criticism was directed towards him because there was basically the the absence of Turks in the book Orientalism. So he didn't really mention the Turkish people or the Ottoman Empire. Maybe because of this ambiguous state, whether they are colonizers or not, or they were colonized or not. There's some kind of an ambiguity which is still debated. I wonder what the, your readings, your texts, the ones you read, and do they see the Ottoman Empire as colonizers or colonized, place? Do they just see the Turks as homogeneous people, or they disregard the Jewish and Armenian people? Basically, we're talking about a very cosmopolitan Ottoman Empire, right? Until recently. That's my question.
Thank you very much, Evren Hocam, for your question. In the American narratives that I read, I did not see any reference to Ottoman Empire being a colonizer or not. But maybe it's because they really did not make a difference or differentiation between the North African states and the Ottoman Empire. The North African states were colonies of the Ottoman Empire at the time, although some historians intend to reject this word colony. Because we are talking about Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, these are separate countries, and they later, beginning in 1830, they began to be colonized by France. So, but I did not see anything that is referring to Ottoman colonization in the American narratives. In terms of Orientalist discourse, yes, definitely. I would argue that, and it is possible to read all of these narratives from an Orientalist discourse. And there are many people actually doing that by offering both a criticism and accepting some of Said's arguments, of course. But the absence of Turk in Said's work is similar to actually American representation during the Greek War of Independence. For example, as I showed you some of the excerpts written by Greeks, or some parts taken from the British newspapers, in the American newspapers, it is, I would be surprised to see if there were many texts written by Ottoman people. Of course, there's a reason to that. The Ottoman Empire was not interacting with the United States very commonly, and there was this language barrier, of course, and there was no Ottoman representation in the United States. Yes, it was very Oriental. It was a part of the Oriental discourse, the representation of Turk in these American travel narratives, in the newspapers, in the Barbary captivity narratives. But I didn't see anything related to colonies. Or maybe just because I wasn't looking for it, I didn't see that.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? No?
Sorry. Oh.
There's-
Actually, if we have, do we still have a couple of minutes?
Yeah, of course. Please.
Okay. I should, as you know, I was trying to get you to go into a little bit more depth about the function psychologically, ideologically, discursively of some of the things that you were talking about. And I thought one of the most interesting passages that you cited was the one, I'm not going to get the details right, but you cited a passage which was about how the Turks, vented upon the dead, the anger that they feel for the living. And then we had the the image of them digging up bones and throwing those bones out into the street. And it seems to me there are all sorts of incredibly interesting ways in which that fantasy, that is a fantasy scenario, right, could be read psychologically and ideologically in terms of discourses of nation and nationalism. And so I just wanted to, I just wondered if you could give us a little bit more detail about what you feel is happening in that particular passage.
Let me share that passage.
Great, thank you.
You're talking about this one, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
The street ones of our fathers. First of all, there is no way of proving that whether these activities happened or not. They might be fantasies, but they might be truth. So there is always a question mark on this topic. I wouldn't accept them as the complete truth, but at the same time, I wouldn't deny them. Because the Chios massacre was really very devastating, and the Turks actually landed on the island in order to take revenge, and they massacred the civilians, whether they became a part of this rebellion or not. Being Greek would be enough to be killed or to be enslaved. So and in terms of this kind of anger felt by both people towards each other, I could believe that. I could believe that happened. But on the other hand, let's take it as a fantasy. It is used, and there's a reason why this particular piece is published in the American newspapers or the British newspapers. The idea was to obtain the support of the American people and the American government, because the Greek revolutionaries were not winning this war around the 1820s until the very late, and they started to become victorious, deemed victorious, only after the great nations of Europe attacked Ottoman and Egyptian navies at Navarin, and they destroyed the navies. Only after that, and with the Russian attack on the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans realized that they could not fight at each front, both against the Russians and the Greeks, with the support coming from Britain and France. So that is why they had to accept Greek independence. So the function, if we are talking about these, if we take this as an exaggerated narratives, the function would be definitely to obtain support of the American people, both financially and officially. The American government, however, did not take part in this war, considering the commercial relations. But there is a lot of people in the American government actually send individual aid to the Greek rebels. But yeah, it was definitely used to increase this Phil-Hellenistic sentiment among the American people, I would say. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. That's interesting. Yeah.
Okay, are there any other questions?
Jason sent something in the chat.
Yeah, he sent a quote from Fleming.
Yeah, I just sent some stuff in the chat that I thought you might be interested in if you haven't seen it already. I used to teach From Russia with Love in my popular fiction class before, and there are some really offensive sections in that book. In fact, they're talking about censoring it in the newer version. But I think they're very revealing, and they seem to be drawing on a lot of the same tropes that you've been talking about. And this is still going on. I mean, with Boris Johnson's poem about Tayyip having sexual relations with a goat and things like this, and now we've got this this media obsession in England with turkey teeth. don't go to Turkey and get turkey teeth. They'll fall out, you'll have big problems, and then you'll have a big problem getting your teeth fixed by the NHS when you get back to England, and so on. So I think a lot of these concerns that you raised, unfortunately, are still with us.
It is. They are still coexistent in American literature, American narratives, and also in the European narratives, definitely. But that is what it makes it interesting for me, actually, that they can go hand in hand in these literary fields and the narratives in general.
Okay, thank you, Jason.
Can I ask a question? I do not have a video there. I cannot raise my hand.
Murat Hocam, buyurun.
Thank you. My question, thank you very much for this resourceful presentation. As you have said in response to Trevor Hope's question, that Americans, in order to keep their commercial ties in a good way with the Ottoman Empire, so that in a way carded or they kept away from the war in Greece, their independence war. Was it a pragmatic decision that they decided to keep themselves away, as following the Monroe Doctrine, being away from the entanglement with those European conflicts? Or was it just only the commerce that they are trying to have, in 1830, the first treaty of commerce would be signed by the America and Ottoman Empire? Can we say this a pragmatic decision? Because as you have said that the Americans have many inspiration. The Capitol Hill name even comes from there. And now the Greeks are going for their independence, sort of from out of colonies. And America did the same thing, and the Brits heavily supporting the Greeks, but America is quite pragmatic with some only individual initiatives to help them.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would actually include these commercial interests into pragmatism too, because it's not only with the Monroe Doctrine. George Washington's farewell address actually supports isolationism from the entanglements of the old world, and George Washington actually suggests that the Americans should focus on the commercial ties, and that is how they are going to build a better and powerful country. And with the Monroe Doctrine, we see a continuation of this idea. Yes, the commercial interests were important. Definitely. Thomas Henderson Perkins was one of the most profitable merchants at the time, who was dealing with Turkey opium to China. And he explains in a newspaper article under an anonymous name that it would be damaging for American business if the government entered to support the Greek revolutionaries. It would not help the American business. It would not help the American citizens. It would not help the American sailors. That is on the one hand. And if we are talking about pragmatism, I wouldn't think America ever considered to send military aid to the Greek revolutionaries. But yeah, we see a continuation of American isolationism with the Monroe Doctrine. And although Philhellenism was very intense in the US, especially in the early 1920s, I am not sure if there are enough sources that would support that the government or the president seriously considered being a part of this war, being entangled in the Greek War of Independence. First of all, there was Great Britain and France that could support the Greek rebels, and Russia, of course, because they are religious protector. They would become a part of this war when necessary. America was, I think it was all the American statesmen were aware of this point. I don't think they ever seriously considered being a part of it. So yeah, I would definitely say commercial and pragmatic by including commercial interest into pragmatism too.
Thank you. And one thing that I cannot figure out the question, because you know the word Turks, Turkish, terrible Turk, and we know that it's the Ottoman period time. Even in Thomas Paine's Age of Reasons, he also makes reference. He doesn't even use the word Muslim church. He used the Turkish church. Here we see that every Muslim is Turks, or every Ottoman citizen is Turkish. And while studying from 2023, tracing back to the early 19th century, such word, I don't know how to handle it. You know, there were many different group of races in the Ottoman Empire. In the Yenicheris, you can find Croatian, you can find Bulgarian, Albanian, or Arab, or Kurds. But the Turk seems to be an upper identity representing the rest of the Ottoman Empire. Yeah, it's a Turkish empire, but could not figure out the issue. But I would like to ask, while you're researching, while writing, how do you handle those? You know, this is a very tough topic also in the last 20 years in Turkey as well.
Yeah, it is very problematic trying to pick the terms and trying to define them in the 21st century, depending on the sources in the 19th century. It is terrible. But if we are talking, I think Emin Hoca also asked about this. I forgot to answer that. Yes, the Ottoman Empire was a multicultural and multinational country. But if we are talking about the Ottoman context, before the 19th, 20th centuries, the people, they were firstly divided as Muslims and non-Muslims. And all the Muslims were also considered Turk or Turkified. On the other hand, if we are talking about the non-Muslims, the main groups were Armenians, Greeks, and Jews. If we are do not really focus on a specific region, they did not really feel the need to specify Bulgarian Muslim, let's say. They were all considered as Turks because it affected their relationship with the government, whether they pay tax, whether they can own or inherit land, etc., etc. So I would say Turk is the upper identity if we are considering all the Muslims, but the rest in American narratives, for example, you see a lot of depictions. There is a section for the Greeks and where they live, how they wore some clothes, what were their traditions. And then we see another section about Armenians, their physical composition, their traditions, their beliefs, etc., etc. So there was a difference in the non-Muslim community based on these three, say. But of course, there were some slight mistakes looking from an outsider view. It's a multinational country, it's a multi-religious country, and in the 19th century, we see a modernization effort in the Ottoman Empire, and it became more problematic trying to define these words actually. So yeah, I think I keep on the safer side by focusing on the Turk as a word to cover only the Muslims without going into specifics. But yeah, there are many very well written books about that too. Charles Marr, if I'm not wrong, was one of them. Thomas Marr, sorry. He deals with these issues better than I did.
Thank you Ayşegül Hocam.
Ben teşekkür ederim hocam.
Okay, thank you all for your
Thank you.
questions. Q&A section was also really interesting as much as the talk. Thank you so much, Ayşegül, for coming today.
There's one more question though.
Oh, Evren, sorry. Evren has a
Well, that's
question.
something that I saw in the chat. May I ask a question, says Samet?
Okay. Sure, Samet, please. Samet is our first year student. Samet? Okay. I learned then that the present inhabitants of Ricketts are not descendants of the people who dwelt there before Turkish rate of 1522. The victorious Muslims left no living human in the village of the vicinity. Is this a, I think this is a passage from your presentation, is it? Do you think that it could be an example for the term, okay, this is something different. Terrible Turk in literature, or an example for the definition of all Turks as Muslims?
Is that from a Conan the Barbarian novel? I think it is.
Samet, Robert Howard, The Blackstone. 19.
Yeah, I think that's a Conan novel, isn't it?
Is it? Samet?
Summit, can you answer?
I think it's just writing. Yes, yes, it's a. Yeah, he
Okay.
said that.
I'll enjoy.
What
What do you think about Conan and the Muslims?
Oh, I don't know. I haven't read any of the Conans. Let me see. I learned at the prison. Honestly, I don't know. It's much earlier than the period that I study, and again, I'm not familiar with this Conans or anything. I would need more context to be able to answer this question, Samet. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Samet. Any other questions? If not, let's end the session today. Thank you all for being here on this lovely Friday. Thank you, Ayşegül.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Murat Hocam,
Thank you.
for coming as well. Murat Erdem, Murat Hocam from Ege University. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
See you all at our next seminar. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hello. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.